Hey everybody, it's Luca from Rackets and Runners. So first of all, welcome back to Vancouver. As you can see, we're back in the studio, although it's a slightly different type of video again today. I also wanted to say I hope you guys enjoyed that video with Tennis Nerd. I had a heck of a lot of fun. I think he did too. Hopefully I can go back to Marbella, especially in the winter, because that warmth was a godsend for sure. We are finally going to do the 100 square inch tier list video, which I know some of you have been waiting for ever since we did the 95 to 98 square inch one. So obviously, that brings me nicely to some criteria. The first bit of criteria is very important. This isn't just going to be 100 square inch rackets. It's mainly going to be 100 square inch rackets. In fact, I think all but 3 are. But I'm also including 99 square inch frames here. You probably noticed I didn't include them in the last one, and that's because I wanted to include them in the 100. The next little bit of criteria you're definitely familiar with at this point, but we have to carry these rackets. We are a retail store. I can't really talk about the product that we don't carry for obvious reasons. So yeah, we gotta carry these rackets at Rackets and Runners. Now I know a lot of you are going to disagree with what I have to say, so if you do, let me know in the comment section. I read all the comments. I try to respond to as many as possible so we can just have a nice little cordial discussion in there if you do disagree. Other than that though, a tier list is pretty self-explanatory. It basically comes down to that this is just a ranking of these rackets compared to each other. I'm going to be putting most of the emphasis on the overall quality of a racket. If it is really, really good in one specific place, that might help it compared to the rest, but yeah, it's going to be mainly overall quality. But without further ado, I've got the tier list right here. So let's get into it. Okay, so we're gonna start by talking about the Babolat Pure Aero 100, and this is a racket I'm very passionate about because it just shows me that Babolat are not afraid to take risks. It also shows me that they know that they're kind of the top dogs in the industry, because the last 2 arrows before this were so insanely spin friendly, and they dialed it back so much on this version of the racket that it could have been a major mistake, but because the racket is so much better in every other way, and it still feels like a spin racket, yep, it's just a massive success, and it's been super, super popular. So what did they do? Well, they tightened up the string bed. It's only got 1 main skip instead of 2. They also made the spin grommets, I mean, they're barely even spin grommets anymore. There is a little bit more space there, but compared to the ones on the last 2 versions, they're not really spin grommets. And they softened up the racket, which also improved the feel. So the control on this thing is leaps and leaps and leaps and bounds better than it was on the last 2. But it is still a spin racket because it's a 16-19 string pattern, and you've got the classic Pure Aero shape. So to me, it's either an S tier racket or an A tier racket. I'm not entirely sure where I'm going to put it in the end of this video, but for now I want to put it in the A tier just because my instincts are telling me this isn't an S tier racket, but I'm wondering if I'm not thinking that compared to the rest of the industry rather than compared to other 100 square inch rackets. I'm going to leave it there, but as usual at the beginning of these tier lists, I'm going to make that little caveat that I can change this in the future. But anyways, okay, the Yonex E-Zone 100. So this is a racket that every time it comes out, I don't give it enough love because obviously we all kind of gravitate to the E-Zone 98 because that racket is so fantastic. But the E-Zone 100 is a phenomenal frame in its own right. And honestly, if I had to pick an E-Zone now that represents this line's goal, it would be the E-Zone 100. So E-Zone is supposed to mean easy one. Basically just a racket that is easy to use. And yes, the 98 is an easy racket to use, especially when you're comparing it to other players' rackets. But the E-Zone 100 is even more user-friendly, and that's because there is literally nothing punishing about this racket. So obviously it has a pretty thick hoop. It's a 16x19 string pattern. It's a 300-gram racket. So those things all kind of make it user-friendly, powerful, easy access to depth. But because it has a pretty thin throat, and because the launch angle is not that high, it's also not overly powerful to the point where you can't control it. The only problem I have with this version of the E-Zone 100, and it's a problem that I've had with most Yonex rackets up until recently, is that it's just too muted. I'm not a fan of vibration dampening mesh. I don't know if I would call it mushy, but it's just a little undefined. The sweet spot is definitely really big, and I'm not always super sure as to where I am in the sweet spot. But honestly, that doesn't really take away from any of its good characteristics. It just means that on contact, I don't have that amazing feel that I want. So that's kind of why I can't put it S tier, but to me, this is another solid A tier racket, and I really can't wait for an E-Zone to come out without vibration dampening mesh. Okay, so the Extreme MP. I feel like my opinion on this racket is going to be a little bit controversial because I'm not the biggest fan of it, because I do feel like compared to other spin rackets, it's living in the past a little bit. Now this thing is good, but it's almost too spin friendly, where it still has those massive, massive spin grommets. It has an open string pattern. I know people have been talking about how it has gotten a little bit tighter than the previous one, and it has, but it's still very open. And the feel and general flex of the frame is just a little bit off to me. It's the type of racket that you basically just have to be playing with tons of spin to control. The current Aero 100 is just so much more well-rounded than the Extreme MP that, yeah, I have a really hard time putting this racket any higher than C tier. I do think this racket has an important role to play in the industry right now, because if you've gotten used to those extreme spin monsters like the last two Aeros, this current Aero isn't that. So if you like that playability, the Extreme MP still gives you that, but in terms of well-rounded playability, it's just not that great. I do think adding Auxetic made the feel a little bit better, but I don't feel as big of an improvement on this frame, probably just because of the way it's designed. So yeah, I'm not the biggest fan of the Extreme MP. I think for the future, they should look into solidifying this frame a little bit more, which will probably mean they take away from its spin, but I do think that's a sacrifice that needs to be done at this point in time with spin rackets. You guys tell me what your opinion is on the evolution of spin rackets, because I do just think something like an Aero 100 is significantly better and still very spin friendly compared to the Extreme MP. But anyways, okay, so the Prestige MP. Okay, so this is a very different racket to the Extreme MP. Honestly, the Prestige MP is kind of out of place on this list, but yes, it's one of the 399 square inch rackets that we're going to be talking about today. I'm talking about the old Prestige MP because it's the only one we have stock for right now, but honestly the difference between the previous one and this one should be very minimal. Hopefully we do get that one in soon. But anyways, I wanted to include this racket because it gives you exactly what you would expect from a 99 square inch frame, where it's kind of the best of both worlds between a lot of control, but then a slightly more forgiving feel. I wouldn't say quite on the level of something like a Gravity. I don't think the Prestige MP is as special of a frame as the Gravity Pro or even Gravity MP, but it is really good, and I just think it's the type of racket that not many people are going to try, A, because it's a Prestige, and B, because it's a little bit weird in terms of spec. But then from those who try it, I think a big portion of those players will really like it. It's just a nice combination of a lot of things, definitely with a heavy emphasis on control and feel, which is what you want from a Prestige. That being said, I don't really want to put it any higher than B tier, again, because there's nothing particularly special. Okay, moving on to the Origin. So this is funny because as much as the 95 to 98 square inch rackets had differences, they're all kind of similar in that they're players' rackets-ish. Here I'm going from talking about a thin beam Prestige MP to one of the most insane rackets I've ever tried in the Origin. Now, I'm definitely not going to put this racket S tier. It's kind of for a similar reason that I couldn't put the RF 97 S tier, although this is like on a whole other level to the RF 97. I haven't done a review on this. I've barely talked about it in any videos that I've done, just because everything about this is insane. And it's not even just the power and spin is on another level. The balance feels off. The swing weight is like, it almost feels more like a golf club than a tennis racket. And as you would expect, when you do make contact with the ball, it just absolutely crushes it. But then it is so difficult to swing because it is so heavy that you're rarely going to be benefiting from that great power and spin. The thing that's interesting to me about the Origin is that, yes, it's far, far too difficult to swing because of those weight and balance characteristics. I would need to caveat this by saying I don't think anyone except for Rafael Nadal should be using this thing in any sort of competitive sphere. But with this much swing weight, the racket is almost so stable that you don't need to make perfect contact. It's not something I would ever even sort of consider switching to, but it is really fun to try it. But yeah, I'm gonna put it in the C tier because it's fun, but it's just not usable, period. So yeah, okay, Gravity Pro, boom, let's move on. Yeah, Gravity Pro, easy S tier racket for me. I think you all know that by now. What makes this racket so special for me is that it really is a top 1 or 2 racket specifically for control. But then compared to the other rackets that are in that high end for control, this racket is so much more well-rounded, and it kind of comes down to that 100 square inch head size, making it more forgiving, more powerful, and more spin friendly. The one tiny flaw is that with the 315 gram weight, this teardrop head shape, and the fairly high swing weight, it does feel like a pretty pretty clunky racket. This is definitely more of a baseliner's frame. I don't think it's the type of racket you want to be spending your life at the net with, just because it is a little bit more difficult to maneuver. But other than that, if we're talking feel, control, but then also spin and power is really, really impressive. To me, it's an easy S tier racket, one of the best rackets on the market right now, one of the best rackets I've personally ever tried. A lot of you have just assumed that this is the racket I use if I'm playing competitively. It's actually not. That's kind of another thing with this racket. It's not an easy frame. It is 315 grams with a high swing weight, so I think that kind of goes without saying, but it really is a pro racket in the truest sense, and you see it. There's a lot of players, well, two that come to mind, Zverev and Rublev, who are actually using some sort of Gravity Pro, so yeah, just a phenomenal stick. Okay, the Pure Drive 100 is a racket that I really want to put into the S tier, but I'm going to put into the A tier for now, just because comparing the Aero 100 and the Pure Drive 100, I actually do think the Aero 100 is a slightly more special racket. What you get with the Pure Drive 100 is definitely power, but it's not like it's an uncontrollable level of power the way you kind of have with an Extreme MP or an Origin. There's still a really solid string bed here. It has pretty good feel. Now, it's not like it has great kind of grab and deposit type of control like you'll get with something like a Gravity or a Prestige, but it's just a solid frame, and what I really like is that the tweaks Babolat make from one generation to the next, they're just slight tune-ups aimed at perfecting the racket rather than drastically changing it. And what that's done is basically made the Pure Drive a sort of safety blanket frame for anyone who's used it before. I do think there's room for improvement in the feel department on this one, especially when I look at the other rackets on offer from Babolat right now. I think the Pure Aero feels a little bit better, and the Pure Aero 98 feels quite a bit better. So if that's the change they're going to be making for the next one, that would make it an easy S tier racket for me. Right now I'm going to put it in the A tier, but again, with the Aero 100 and Drive 100, I'm kind of want to reserve the right to change that, because I think the E-Zone 100 is a little bit more flawed than them. So if I have to bump them up to the S tier, I will. Okay, the Clash 100 is, I think this is a solid A tier racket. It's definitely not S tier, but here's why I don't think it's B tier. Now, obviously, when the original Clash 100 came out, it was a completely unique racket compared to anything else that had ever come out, because it was basically a Pure Drive style tweener that had comfort in mind, so it was way softer than everything else. So yes, this racket is insanely comfortable, but it's also stable, spin friendly, and powerful considering how low that flex rating is. Now the feel is definitely not traditional, but for people that are looking for something user-friendly and comfortable, the Clash 100 is the best option, because generally speaking, comfortable rackets are soft, thin-beamed control frames, and those are definitely not user-friendly. So this fills a very important gap in the market. Now it has its flaws, don't get me wrong. The feel is definitely weird. The sweet spot is big and undefined, and I would prefer to play with something like the Pure Drive 100, because I do think that stiffness adds a bit of crispness and feel that you just don't get with the Clash 100. But the Clash is what it is, and that's a racket that has allowed a lot of players who might have been needing to move away from tennis because of discomfort issues an option and kept them in the sport. And because of that, I just can't put this racket any lower than A tier, because it's kind of a magical racket in that sense. Okay, the Boom MP. Now, I'm very excited to talk about this racket because you all kind of know my opinions on the Boom Pro. That being said, this is not just a more powerful and more user-friendly version of the Boom Pro. I think the Boom Pro is the sweet spot for this design, because this thing is just a little bit too wild. I can't really put it any higher than C tier, to be honest. There's a buddy of mine who's kind of a head racket connoisseur, and he described the Boom MP as a box of chocolates, because you never really know what you're gonna get. And that's pretty much the perfect way to describe this racket. Now, the Boom Pro suffers from that a little bit, but because of this unique shape and the fact that the sweet spot is far up the frame and that the string bed is so open up there, it's very, very erratic. Significantly more than the Boom Pro and more than the V-Core 98, 95, and 100, which have a similar design. It does have pretty good spin and really good power, but again, unlike other rackets that have good spin and good power like the Pure Drive 100 and Pure Aero 100, you don't have that solid string bed to fall back on, so you kind of have the same issue as the Extreme MP. So yeah, Boom MP to me is not just a bigger Boom Pro. Boom Pro feels more crisp, well-defined, way more solid, way more controlled. And yeah, just in general is a better representation of what this shape can be in its best playability. Okay, the Percept 100. Now, the 100 square inch version of the Percept slash VCore Pro or whatever is gaining a lot of popularity. I'm not the biggest fan of this racket because I find that the isometric head shape, when it's made for control, just doesn't really feel right if it's 100 square inches. The isometric head shape already makes the racket feel bigger than it is. So it's almost like I'm playing with a 101 or a 102 with this thing, not just with the feel off the string bed, but also the clunkiness of the frame. I do find this racket to be more clunky than it needs to be. That being said, I love the Gravity Pro. I don't know, there's just something about the swing pattern of the Gravity Pro that feels right. Whereas this thing, I have a disconnect with the head. I'm gonna try to take my personal opinion out of it and rate it off of its own merits, but I still can't really put it higher than B tier just because I don't think the control is that good. And if you wanna go to a 100 square inch control racket, that's probably because you're looking for a bit more spin, power, and especially user friendliness. And in that category of rackets, I just think there are better options. The Gravity Pro isn't necessarily directly comparable to the Percept 100, but there is a couple rackets that we'll talk about later that are. Okay, so the Rafa is actually a really cool racket, and really the only similarity that there is with the Origin here is the balance, because the Rafa is basically just the Origin with like 40 grams less and way less swing weight. But for a racket that only weighs 290 grams, it still has a really hefty swing weight. So you can swing this thing pretty quickly because it is so light, but then there is a lot of mass in the head. So kind of like with the Origin, you get more spin and power than you would expect. The other thing they did with the Rafa compared to the Origin is make the string bed more open. Now, I kind of like that because if you have a more open string bed, you don't need as much mass behind the ball to get the same amount of spin and power. So because it's lighter, it was actually a pretty good idea to do that. Interestingly enough, I do think the Rafa is more controlled than something like the Extreme MP, which is why I'm actually going to put it in a higher tier than the Extreme. I think this is a B tier racket. It doesn't have spin grommets like the Extreme does. As you can tell, I'm kind of a hater of spin grommets, but also I just find that the racket has a better overall flex and feel. That being said, the feel on the Aero Rafa is definitely a little dated because it's the Aero Pro drive layup, and you can definitely feel that. This racket can get jarring pretty quickly, so for those of you who have discomfort issues, I would just avoid it altogether. I don't think you can salvage this thing's comfort by putting a more comfortable string or a poly at a lower tension or whatever. My one worry with the Aero Rafa is that if you get used to this racket, when Nadal retires, I don't think they're gonna have an option that's 290 grams with such a high swing weight. But for now, this is a solid B tier racket that provides a really nice hitting experience and is very unique. So yeah. Okay, so we are going to move on to the Speed MP now, but full disclosure, this is not the same day. I started talking about the Speed MP and I was saying absolute nonsense, and that's when I realized the jet lag had really hit my brain. So I decided to take a break, but we're back. And we're gonna talk about the Speed MP, which is a racket I absolutely love because to me, the Speed represents the perfect jack of all trades racket. And yes, better than the Radical, which I know kind of has the jack of all trades label to it. The 23mm beam is neither thick nor thin, so you get a good combination of power and control. The 16x19 string pattern is excellent for spin. And then you look at the general profile and design of the frame, and it's not super classic, but it's also not got that undulating modern design. So in terms of response and feel off the string bed, it's sort of semi-traditional, but also more stable and powerful than you would expect. So to me, this is kind of the perfect jack of all trades racket. And if you go back to what I was saying about the Percept 100 being one of those 100 square inch rackets that's kind of built toward being more control oriented, I mentioned that there was another racket that swings through the air a little bit better and feels more natural. That was the Speed MP that I was talking about. But anyways, moving on to the Shift 99. Okay, so this is actually a racket that's been compared to the Speed MP in a lot of ways, and I kind of understand it. Same beam thickness, similar shape, but to me it's not really anything like the Speed, and that's because of the feel on contact. Now for one, the Shift is significantly stiffer than the Speed, but it also has that super unique vertical bending characteristic where you feel the ball sink into the string bed and then shoot out with a ton more spin than you would expect. So that vertical bending characteristic is awesome because it basically turns it into a spin racket, but it does make the feel a little bit weird, which is why I can't put it in the S tier. But if they can can somehow figure out how to make this feel a little bit less muted and bizarre and still have that amazing vertical bending spin characteristic, they could be onto a winner here, because it's another one of those proper spin rackets that doesn't sacrifice nearly as much control as something like an Extreme. Honestly, Wilson keeps on kind of killing it with the innovation these days. So yeah, nice A tier racket. Okay, Pro Staff X. I just said a really nice thing about Wilson, and now I'm going to say some not so nice things, because to me, the Pro Staff X is not a very good racket. I don't know if I'd call it lazy, but it just feels like they completely missed the boat with this thing, because the whole idea behind the Pro Staff X was to make a Pro Staff feeling racket that's more user-friendly and that a wider variety of people can use. My problem with this racket is that it's still 315 grams, has a super high swing weight, and it has a 100 square inch head size. So it's difficult to bring through contact because it's so clunky. The problem is it has a 16 by 19 string pattern. So if you want to control it, you have to play with spin, and you're just not able to generate the same racket head speed with the Pro Staff X that you can with the Pro Staff 97. So it's just a racket that ends up being too difficult to control, too powerful, and that kind of defeats the whole purpose of it being a user-friendly Pro Staff. Just feels like a bit of an identity crisis racket. I'm not gonna put in the D tier because I do think the feel is still Pro Staffy enough to where if you have played with Pro Staffs your whole life, if you're now starting to slow down as a tennis player, you could switch to this and benefit from a slightly bigger sweet spot. But other than that, I just don't really see who would want to play with this thing. Okay, enough negative things said about the Pro Staff X. Let's move on to the Pure Drive Tour. So this is a really good racket, but I'm going to put it in a tier under the Pure Drive, and I don't really want to put in the B tier. So I think what I might do here is move the Pure Drive to the S tier. You know what? Yes, I'm moving the Pure Drive to the S tier. The Pure Drive just is an S tier racket. I'm nitpicking with feel a little bit, but now that I think about it, feel is really good on this one, especially compared to what it's been for the past like 4 or 5 generations. The reason I'm putting the Tour in a tier under the Pure Drive is for one simple reason, and that's because I think the Pure Drive is in its perfect spec in that 300 gram weight. The only reason you'd want to go for the Tour is if you want more stability, but I think this racket is engineered so well at that 300 gram weight that you don't really need that extra stability, and I certainly don't think the loss in maneuverability and swing speed is worth what you're gaining in stability when you do go up to those 15 grams. That being said, this racket basically has every other characteristic of the Pure Drive 100, but because of that, I'm going to put it in a tier under, but it's still a Pure Drive, so you really can't go wrong with it. Okay, the Speed Pro. Now, this is not just a 15 gram heavier Speed MP, because the Speed Pro is one of the only 1820s that I can also say is quite a powerful racket. You get a little bit of extra depth and pace that you don't get on something like the Gravity Pro because it is so thin. Here's why I'm gonna put the Speed Pro in a tier under the Gravity Pro though, is because that extra power is good, that's fine, but you lose out on control and a bit of consistency from the string bed here because the shape isn't as traditional as the Gravity Pro. And I don't know why a player who's looking for the consistency and stability of an 1820 would want the significant increase in power that you get on the Speed Pro. So to me, the Gravity Pro just does a slightly better job of accomplishing what it sets out to do, and I think these two rackets set out to do a similar thing. The other thing that's worth noting is that the Speed Pro does have more spin than the Gravity Pro, but I just think that if you want to make it into the S tier, you have to be a special racket. I don't think the Speed Pro is quite there, but it's a solid A tier racket. Okay, the Shift 99 Pro. Now this is a racket I really enjoy hitting with, but I'm gonna have to put it in the B tier because I think the Shift is better represented by the standard Shift 99 than by the Pro. And that's because the Shift is a spin racket at the end of the day. And the problem with the Pro is that it's 15 grams heavier, it has a pretty hefty swing weight, and of course it has an 18 by 20 string pattern. When I first saw this racket, I couldn't believe how tight this string pattern was. It's one of the tightest 1820s I've ever seen, but it's way more spin friendly than you would expect from something so dense. And again, that kind of comes down to the vertical bending being super effective at what it does. So yeah, it is a spin racket. I actually don't have that much issue with the 18 by 20 string pattern because it does produce so much spin. But the one thing I want to feel from a spin racket is a quick whippy feel through contact, and because it's so heavy and has a hefty swing weight, it feels pretty clunky through the air. So the racket head speed is tougher to generate, and it doesn't have that mid-swing maneuverability of something like a Pure Aero where you can just crank it through contact and hit with a ton of spin. So yes, you gain consistency, stability, and control compared to the Shift 99, but I think it loses a bit too much of its identity as a spin racket at that point. And in terms of other 1820s that are fairly forgiving, powerful, and spin friendly, I just think the speed is a better overall frame. So it's a very solid stick. It's probably my favorite B tier racket, so I'm just gonna put it at the top there, but I can't put it on the same tier as the Shift or the Speed Pro. Okay, moving on to the Ultra 100. Now this is a really good racket, and I actually don't know which tier I'm going to put it in. I'm glad that I moved the Pure Drive 100 up to the S tier because there is a significant gap to me in performance between the Pure Drive 100 and the Ultra 100. And the main difference is going to be not in power, not in spin. The Ultra 100 and the Pure Drive 100 are very similar in those two regards. To me, it's just that X factor solidity and good control that I get on the Pure Drive 100 that I just don't get on the Ultra 100, and that's fine because this isn't meant to be a control racket, neither is the Pure Drive, but that's what makes the Pure Drive an S tier frame, is the fact that you just do get good control from it. And this is just a classic power racket where, yeah, the control is going to be lacking because it's a power racket, and that's fine. You know what? I am gonna put this racket B tier. The reason I'm putting it in the B tier is because all these rackets in the A tier and the S tier are fantastic rackets, and you can't really find better playability from something else. Whereas the Ultra 100, there are people that will go for this racket, but that's going to be more so because it worked really well for their game rather than it being better than its direct competition, which isn't true for these other rackets in the A and S tier. These are kind of the leaders in their category, whereas the Ultra is a bit of a follower. But anyways, we'll move on from the Ultra 100, a solid B tier racket. Okay, well, we're moving on from the Ultra 100, but we're gonna talk about another Wilson racket. See, the Clash 100 Pro is another one of those rackets that has a lighter sibling that is just a better version of it. Because if you're going for a Clash, it's probably because you want the ultimate comfort setup. And one of the things that can take away from a racket's comfort is if it's too heavy. And the Clash 100 Pro isn't that heavy, it's only 310 grams, but it is heavier than the Clash 100. And the only reason you'd want to go heavier with the Clash is if you want more stability and potentially more comfort, because a heavier racket takes away from a bit of the brunt of the ball. That's just not necessary because the technology within the Clash is so impressive that the racket is already plenty stable at this lighter weight, and comfort will never ever be an issue with the Clash 100, so you don't need to go up in weight to make it more comfortable. The other thing is, once you've made it up to this 310, 315 gram weight, most rackets are comfortable and they're going to have significantly better feel and control. So yeah, the Clash 100 Pro to me is just a little bit lost in this industry. I'm going to move it into the C tier because I think all these rackets in the B tier serve a better purpose than Clash 100 Pro. But yeah, let's move on. Okay, the Gravity MP. So I feel like at this point I've said so many good things about the Gravity Pro and to a certain extent the Gravity Tour that people are just going to expect that whenever it's time to talk about a Gravity, I'm going to love the racket. I wish I liked the Gravity MP a little bit more. First of all, I think it's a little bit too light in stock form. I think Head was kind of cheating when they made it 295 grams. I think they felt a little bit pressured with the fact that the Clash 100 was 295 grams. They were kind of trying to make a similar easy playing, lighter weight frame, and I just think this racket needs at least 5 extra grams to be stable enough. I mean, this is a 22 millimeter beam racket. The fact that it's 295 grams is just a little bit light to me. The other thing is the string bed. Now, maybe this is just a me problem, but I don't think the 16x20 string bed complements the shape and design as well as the 1820. The thing with the Gravity for me is that it's just an insanely solid, stable, and consistent frame. And by taking away those two main strings, I feel like they've added a slight element of wildness that doesn't really fit with my experience when playing with the other two Gravities. And yes, this racket is more spin friendly than the other Gravities, and that's good, but it's kind of a reverse situation to what I was saying with the Speed Pro and Gravity Pro earlier with the Gravity MP and the Speed MP. If you're going to play a more spin-oriented game, I just think the Speed MP is a better overall racket than the Gravity MP. The loss in control and consistency you have here is not made up for by the increase in spin when you compare it directly to the Speed MP. Here's the thing, I just don't have the heart to put this racket in the B tier, so that's why I'm actually going to move the Speed MP into the S tier, which is not something I thought I was going to do. Do I want to move the Speed into the S tier? I'm not moving the Gravity into the B tier. That's definitely not happening. But I'm also looking at this S tier and I see Pure Drive 100 and Gravity Pro, which to me are spectacular rackets, S for spectacular. And I just, no, you know what? I can't move the Speed into the S tier. I'm just gonna move it to the very top of the A tier. I'm not going to organize the tiers, but just make a mental note. I think the Speed is a better overall racket than the Gravity MP, if that's important for you. Okay, moving on to the V-Core 100. Now I like this racket more than the Boom MP, but it does suffer from a similar issue of inconsistency, again, because that shape is so unique and the sweet spot is so open up there that it's just a little bit more wild. I again think that the VCore 98 is a better version of this design, but the VCore 100 is a better racket than the Boom MP, mainly because it's more technologically advanced. To me, the VCore 100 is kind of a perfect in-between racket when you're comparing the Pure Aero 100 and the Extreme MP, where it's not as wild as the Extreme MP, but also not as solid and controlled as the Pure Aero 100, and all three of these are on a similar level in terms of spin, so putting it in a tier between the two kind of feels perfect for me. Okay, now like I did with the 95 to 98 square inch tier list, I'm going to see if I want to move anything around here. So Gravity Pro, I'm absolutely not moving out of the S tier. Pure Drive 100, I've talked myself into fully believing that this is an S tier racket, which it is. Speed MP, do I want to put it in the S tier? No, I just don't want to put it in the S tier. I don't think it's as special a frame as the Gravity or the Pure Drive. It's very good. The next one could go into the S tier. I don't know what I would want improved. I'm always down for an improvement in feel on constant beam rackets. Pure Aero 100. I kind of want to put this racket in the S tier. I just want to see what would that S tier look like. You know what? I think the Pure Aero 100 is an S tier racket. I'm so impressed that Babolat took the leap they did in closing off the string bed to make the racket so much more consistent than the last two. This is such a big improvement on those. Yeah, to me, this is an S tier. This might be the best spin racket ever, because you could have your rose tinted glasses on and be saying, well, no, Luca, the Aero Pro drives of old are better than this racket. And I would disagree, because this is basically the same mold as those old Aero Pro drives. It's just the layup that changed, and I think this layup is way better than old Aero Pro drive layups. I think the feel is improved, and I think the comfort is improved. So to me, this might be the best spin racket ever. E-Zone 100 could be an S tier racket if the feel was better. Again, looking forward to trying that without vibration damping mesh. Clash 100, I'm definitely not putting in the S tier, and I'm definitely not putting it any lower than A tier. This racket is great at what it does. The Shift 99, for a first foray into this design, they knocked it out of the park. If they improve the feel, this definitely could become an S tier racket one day. Pure Drive 100 Tour, I think I made my case pretty clear with this one. Speed Pro, do I want to put it in the S tier? No, because again, I would pick the Gravity Pro over the Speed Pro. Gravity MP, again, make a mental note. I think the Speed MP is a better overall racket than the Gravity MP, but not better to the point where I want to separate them in terms of tiers, and I'm definitely not putting the Gravity MP in the B tier. VCore 100, this could be an A tier racket, but yeah, I just can't get on board with that inconsistency, and I think the other two VCores are better rackets. Shift 99 Pro, again, slight identity crisis. There's going to be a lot of identity crisis rackets coming up here that I put in the lower tiers. But yeah, the Shift is a spin line, and the Pro kind of goes away from that a little bit too much. Prestige MP, I almost want to put this racket A tier, because when I look at it compared to the B tier rackets, I would probably pick the Prestige MP over any of these B tier rackets, but that's more so my personal opinion, and I am more of a control rackets type of guy, and there isn't too much special about this racket. Percep 100, this could be a very controversial opinion. I know some people who would probably put this racket in the S tier, but yeah, there's just something about the dimensions of this racket that feels a little bit off to me, so I just can't put it in the A tier. Aero Rafa is a super cool racket, very unique, but too flawed to put in the A tier. The Ultra 100 is just proof to me that the B tier definitely doesn't mean bad. These are all actually really good rackets. It's just the other rackets are more special. So yeah, B tier rackets are good. Definitely could work for a lot of players, but we're in a competitive industry right now. What can I say? Extreme MP. Now, probably not a bad racket, but a racket that I think is living in the past a little bit. I'm not gonna move this racket up. I was thinking about moving it up, but when I saw the VCore 100, I think the VCore 100 is a solid B tier racket and is better than the Extreme MP, so I'm not gonna move that. Origin C tier, like Nadal would disagree with that, but the fact that it's just unplayable, I can't put it any higher. It's fun. If you can, give it a shot. Boom MP is the only racket I would almost look at putting in the D tier, because I just think there's too many things off about this racket. But no, I think the power and comfort are pretty good here. Pro Staff X, I would personally put this in the D tier because I struggled so much to play with it, but I understand who would appreciate some of this playability. And the Clash 100 Pro, I mean, this is just a comfort line. If you're looking for comfort, go for the Clash 100. And if you want something heavier that's comfortable, the Gravity Pro is super comfortable and has a lot of better characteristics. Okay, so that is the 100 square inch tier list done. Now, before we wrap up the video, I want to remind you that any of the rackets you see here or any of the rackets we talk about on this channel ever, you can check out on our website, racketsandrunners.ca. I also really want to know your opinion on this tier list because I'm more confident about my opinion on 95 to 98 square inch rackets than I am on 100 square inch rackets. I think this could be a little bit controversial. So let me know in the comments what you think. I'm excited to have a conversation down there. The other thing I'd like to know is what you guys want me to tier list next. Now, I've got some video ideas coming for the next few weeks, but I do like making these tier lists. Let me know. Let me know what you guys want me to tier list. Open to some suggestions. But yeah, that is going to be the end of the video. Thank you so much for watching. Please like, please subscribe, please drop a comment, and I will see you in the next one.